Welcome to a limited series podcast from WealthManagement.com. What financial advisors need to know about ESG rating systems. Let's jump right into this week's episode.
Hello and welcome. Today we have a special guest, and that is Claire Veuthey, and she is the Director of ESG and Impact at OpenInvest. Good afternoon. How are you?
Great, thanks.
Davis, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. Thanks, Eric.
All right. You brought Claire on. Why is Claire on the show today?
Well, I heard Claire speak online, and I have followed some of her multifaceted pathway through what has become this very well-known topic, at least in colloquial terms, of ESG investing. She's got a lot of experience, and I thought maybe I'd just ask you to say a few words about your background, Claire.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to be here, Davis. I've played a lot of roles in ESG investing, and that's really where I've spent my whole career. I've been in some research roles, researching companies for ESG rating companies. I've sold the research. I joined an investment team and used the research for our investment purposes. And right now, as you know, I'm at OpenInvest, and I'm responsible for the ESG component of our tech product. I also run marketing and PR. I really try to ensure we're providing ESG for humans and not just for ESG or investing wonks, of which there are more and more. And a final note, our mission at OpenInvest is really to try to democratize access to customized investing, including customization based on ESG elements, which is why my experience is relevant. Since access to customization is currently pretty ring-fenced and mostly accessible just to the very wealthy.
Right. And I think that probably gives our audience a great understanding of why I wanted Claire to be on the show. And with that note, I guess we could really start at the very basic level. What to you, and I guess to OpenInvest, what is ESG investing? How would you define that?
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, as I'm sure you know, ESG is while it sounds really wonky and has gotten to be, we often use the term impact investing, but broadly I'd say, so ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. And the reason it's those three words is that there are issues that by and large have been left out traditionally of fundamental-based financial investing or fundamental analysis.
Right.
So we define it as investing with the intention to generate a beneficial social or environmental impact alongside financial returns. So it's traditional investing with the intention to take into account factors that historically have been left out in the investment process.
That's very helpful. And since the majority of our audience here is made up of financial advisors, what would you say that advisors really need to know about ESG rating systems? And that's a real big part of why I've done this episode and the previous one, is I think there's an absence generally of straightforward information for advisors on that topic a lot of times.
Absolutely. I think ESG investing has become a real area of specialization, which means, as is often the case in our industry, there's a lot of jargon. I think how I would recommend advisors think about ESG ratings is really as an additional tool to their process. So how I would recommend advisors use ESG ratings is as an additional element to their investment process, right? If they're looking at company level ratings, then they should use those alongside their traditional factors. So if it's a credit rating, if they're looking at an issue, or PE metrics, or whatever ratios they prefer in their own investment process. Many advisors also look at ESG ratings at the fund level, and those are often aggregations of the company level ratings that an aggregator has put together for consumption by advisors. So Morningstar does this based on Sustainalytics data. MSCI has also rolled out fund level ratings. And those will, again, give a bit of a flavor of how, based on one of these third parties, and the cases I've mentioned are Sustainalytics and MSCI, how this fund performs in some way based on ESG elements. So are the companies in this fund doing a good job of reporting on their environmental, social, and governance impact practices and policies? Reporting is a big piece of it. It's not the only one, but it is a dominant factor in the rating systems. There's an additional element which is not always comfortable to talk about, but investment folks sometimes forget that they still need to use their brains to understand these ESG elements. especially if they're going to rely only on one rating system. They need to understand them enough to know what the ratings mean. So advisors and others sometimes get pretty wound up when all the rating agencies don't rate the same companies in the same way. But I don't think anyone has a fit when Moody's and S&P give slightly different credit ratings to new issues, as long as they're largely pointing in the same direction, right? They are familiar with those ratings, and they have a sense of what it means when Fitch rates an issue as X and S&P rates an issue as Y. And ESG rating systems are essentially a little bit younger and frankly less conflicted than traditional credit rating agencies. So I think it's only normal that you'd get a little bit of dissonance, but in order for advisors to get comfortable with the dissonance, they do have to do a little bit of homework and dive into the methodology of these ratings and understand really what those numbers or scores are telling them.
Yeah, I have noticed that a few advisors that I've talked to who are sort of just dipping their toe into really getting an understanding, I guess largely with questions from their clients, are a bit not sure where to begin. And that would throw them for a loop if they're not, if they do see big differences in how the various ratings agencies and or research is looking at a particular investment or fund, et cetera.
Yeah, it's definitely understandable.
Well, along those similar lines, the segue would be, for me, what, the advisors need to understand the rating systems themselves, but what do you think are the most important things that they need to convey to investors about ESG? Because I also think there's sort of a surfacey, I think there's a wide range of understanding among investors themselves about what ESG actually is. What do you think is most important for the advisor to be able to pass on to the client, the investor, about ESG?
Yeah, good question. There's a couple of elements. One I'd say is important for advisors to understand, and I think this will come out in their conversations with their clients, is talking about ESG elements is really a way to get to know your client better and make sure you're serving them well, especially in this day and age when you have a lot of robo-advisors. Essentially every major bank has either developed one or partnered with one off the shelf. And advisors increasingly have to compete with bots, right, for their services, or at least for some component of the service. So there's a lot that humans could do that algorithms and machines can't do. But asset allocation isn't, at this point, really one of them. It's really the human component of understanding your client best, getting a sense of what they value, what they care about, what matters to them, and how that's reflected in their financial life. So we really see ESG as a great touch point in that sense, and an excuse to get away from the charts and numbers that their clients may not be very excited about, right? I know some folks I know who work with financial advisors receive an email or something in the mail every quarter, which they never look at until they meet their advisor once a year and kind of like slog through these 20 pages of charts and text that largely go over their head. I think ESG can be a segue to talking about things that are a little closer to their heart and really meaningful to them.
Actually, that's great, because a lot of advisors talk about, well, we need more of these touch points. And my understanding from talking to some, especially the older advisors, that often they are kind of intimidated by this idea of ESG, but it could be a good kind of icebreaker conversation, it sounds like.
Absolutely. I think it's also a great, and this is said a lot, but I think it's also a great touch point and a way to connect with the next generation. There is a fair bit of research that shows that millennials specifically, but women more generally across age ranges, are more interested than the average in ESG investing or some element of impact investing. And you can see that in the numbers, the research that's done that tries to scope out the size of the market. So global sustainable investing has reached, based on some estimates, more than 30 trillion globally. And investors who integrate ESG elements, or at least investment shops that integrate it, represent something like 17 trillion. So, and that has grown a ton in the last 15 or so years. So I think there's a huge opportunity there beyond client retention. I think it's also a great tool for acquisition and growing their book, which I'm pretty sure every advisor is interested in.
Absolutely. And that's interesting too, because, we're constantly in the media talking about the great wealth transfer. And I think too often advisors these days don't necessarily think far ahead about how to talk to the children of their clients. which could be a pretty bad thing if their ages, the advisor and the client, are pretty close, and both are kind of inching towards retirement. And near future, they need to have some means of a good conversation to have with the children. So possibly this is a good subject to maybe bring up. Are your kids interested in ESG investing, even if you aren't? Okay.
I'd add there is research that shows that clients are more likely to change advisors when there's an intergenerational transfer of wealth, but also within the same generation. So again, traditionally, advisors have worked mainly with men who historically have been the kind of financial stewards of a family's wealth. And what we've seen happen, I've seen it anecdotally, but again, there's research backing this up, is that wives and widows often realize when they become the ultimate decision maker that the advisor wasn't really listening to them, and they'll often change to someone that they feel is a little bit more in line with what they're looking for, both in a tone and in a results point of view. So, not to scare advisors, but I think it's not only an opportunity for gain, but it's also a risk management tool for your business to make sure that your current clients don't walk out.
That is a great point. And there have been some very startling surveys done to show that the wives of a client who have passed away, that it's anywhere from 60 to 75, 80% say they will change advisors. Very good point, Claire.
I'm sure none of the advisors think that they're in the 60 to 75%. But
yes, I think you're right. I think you're right, having talked to many of them. Well, moving on, when it comes to ESG and SRI, what are some of the most misunderstood aspects? For advisors and maybe investors, but I guess start with advisors.
The most, by far the biggest, most important one, and this is across the board, is the assumption of concessionary returns. I think most people still assume that integrating environmental, social, and governance issues into the investment process requires accepting that you will not do as well and get sub-market returns. There's been a lot of academic research on this, and the answers are fairly clear. Unfortunately, the industry hasn't really picked up on those answers and still leans on some pretty basic theoretical assumptions. So based on multiple pretty focused studies assessing exactly this question, as well as a number of meta-studies that have looked at the tens or hundreds of studies that have been done on it, investing according to ESG principles doesn't significantly impact returns either way. So neither positively nor negatively. And again, this is on average. So maybe a last point is that even if ESG investing doesn't support outperformance, the finding that using ESG elements doesn't depress returns is pretty remarkable. It means that it's free.
Right.
So why wouldn't?
So why not? Exactly.
Right. It's a bit like buying some item of clothing off the shelf 2 sizes too large when the right size for you is right next to it and at the same price. You're just not picking the thing that would be a better fit for you for, frankly, no good reason.
That is an excellent point as well. And I guess that's one that I have seen it either often dismissed or not looked at to a great deal of depth. This aspect of performance. And when it comes to this, do you see any differences in active versus passive management? Just as sort of an aside, is that something you guys looked at all?
Interesting. I would say that ESG has really, really started out by and large in equities in active management. OpenInvest is a passive manager, so we're taking a slightly different approach, and I think the implementation then is fairly different. You're looking for something different from your data sources. I'd say active management. I wouldn't say active ESG management is fundamentally different from active management. I think the reasons a manager might decide to lean into a position versus another might be more based on ESG, but it might also be based on fundamental reasons or some combination of the two. But it's clear to me that different styles of investing actually are the more relevant differentiation between investment managers versus whether or not they do ESG.
Interesting. Okay. You want to break that down just a little bit, styles of investing?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, so active management based on ESG elements, or even not even based on, but including ESG elements, will, by and large, take a relatively small number of concentrated positions, and is making those managers are making a heavier bet, essentially, that they've picked winners and they're going to do better than the market. Many of those base it on ESG, if that's part of how they market themselves into what their investment process actually looks like. So those managers will typically claim, look, we'll do better, one, because we have great fundamental analysis, and also because we take into account this information that isn't well understood by the market, and it therefore gives us an advantage in picking better names. On the passive side, so at least at OpenInvest, the fundamental philosophy is very different. Most passive investors don't purport or try or say that they will beat the market. The point is to match the market. And then the challenge is really in great execution in matching the market, right? And doing it typically at low cost, because fees obviously into returns. And if you're hiring an active manager, humans are expensive, which means that there's a kind of necessary bite out of your returns, whatever they are, that goes to pay the people who are doing that work.
Right.
On the passive side, what you're looking for is less very deep dive of companies to allow you to pick winners, and more good, solid coverage. So it's more about breadth than depth, in my view. And then I think the difference or the advantage of any fund manager will really lie in their technology. Essentially, again, the operation. It will lie in the operationalization of matching the market, right? So at OpenInvest, we have a proprietary optimizer that trades off ESG and tracking error. So tracking error is a measure of risk. It's essentially volatility relative to the reference index. And what we'll show clients is, look, for a little bit more tracking error, so a little bit more movement around the reference index performance, will get you this much more ESG based on the things that you've told us you care about that fit into your bucket of ESG.
Okay. Well, when I started to think about this and look into ESG rating systems, I really came across three big ones. And really only two, I guess, have what I would call market share, and another one being Bloomberg. So the two that I was most familiar with are MSCI and Sustainalytics, and then Bloomberg. But I think that you would have to have a Bloomberg box, one of their screens, to be able to access it. Does that sound accurate?
Yeah, correct. That's right.
Okay. Well, when it comes to are there any other major systems or
Thomson Reuters, similar to Bloomberg, does a bit of everything, so provides a lot of data. MSCI and Sustainalytics are really the preeminent players in terms of creating their own rating systems. I think what Thomson and Bloomberg do is funnel through the ESG data that companies are already providing, but not always with a ton of context, or certainly no weighting, which I think both Sustainalytics and MSCI really try to do, is place more weight on the sub-elements of ESG that they consider most relevant to the company.
What would you say are some of the strengths and weaknesses of the various offerings out there?
So, as with many people and things, the weaknesses are really the flip side of their strengths. And I'd say these main ESG rating systems, which you named, have built their ratings based on a very detailed evaluation of every company in their universe. There's often hundreds of data points. By and large, their systems exist because historically there has not been a standard way of understanding which ESG issues matter for which companies. So these companies have essentially made up their own systems over decades and refined them and improved them and tested them. But they've essentially created those that hierarchy of issues. So the plus is that they're based on really deep, granular research. They have systems, armies of analysts who pour through reports and identify exactly the sub metric that they've considered relevant for a company in this sub-industry and in this region. The flip side of that is that it often makes the top line score pretty hard to understand. So Sustainalytics has historically scored out of 100. MSCI has moved to something that looks more like a bond rating. But But without a bit more context, it's really hard to know if a 56 is actually that much worse than a 62. And often they'll provide a little bit of distribution and context, but it's the top line score also gets a little diluted by the sheer number of data points included. So good, bad things might average out somewhere. And I think we can say with some confidence that that's not what happens in the public eye. So Johnson & Johnson right now is just an example, is being pummeled for its involvement in the opioid crisis. It's obviously not the only facet of the company, but it's pretty hard to ignore right now. And the fact that they have really great CSR reporting and lots of women on their board doesn't seem super relevant in this particular moment. You're not going to see that reflected in an MSCI or Sustainalytics report. Maybe it shouldn't be, right? Maybe they're meant to be more neutral, kind of longer term assessments. But these systems are often not responsive enough to issues that will take on a really big weight, even if it's just for a moment, because they're meant to compare thousands of companies across industries, market caps, regions, governance systems, etc. So I think this is why the industry gets really wonky. You need to have a ton of context in your head to really have a deep understanding of what a 56 based on Sustainalytics means. So that's what I'd say is the plus and the minus. They've done a ton of work to create something really thoughtful, reflective, but the problem is it's kind of complicated and it's not really intuitive what the results mean.
Well, that's actually a good segue to what I kind of have as my last kind of major question here. The whole notion of AI and especially machine learning and being able to analyze unstructured data. I've read where that could have a big, meaningful amount of leverage on how these systems evolve over time. Do you find that's the case, that taking into account things like what you said about Johnson & Johnson, which without having the ability to do that and using more of a qualitative, analyst, human-driven approach to doing this, rather than, or in addition to sort of having AI be able to crawl out there and take in data across whether it's just what's being said in the media, but also maybe from reports in scientific circles, et cetera. Is that something that's going to be finding its way into the systems as they are now, or do you think that's going to really come from new offerings out there? Do you think that there is an importance to looking at unstructured data for these systems?
Yeah, good question. I think AI and machine learning, of course, will impact this space. A lot of picking good stocks, either for passive management or active management, even creating indices, has been based on historically human judgment, right? Processes that are codified, et cetera. But machines are way better at doing that than we are, certainly at a large scale, systematic way. So it seems inevitable that there will be more AI and machine learning used to teach the AI to do it better, or at least better than most of us would. I think you touched on something really important, is I think the combination of the human and AI is going to be what's most relevant. So I mentioned the armies of analysts that are employed by mostly Sustainalytics and MSCI and a couple of other providers that exist. The reason it's still largely done by humans is that ESG data isn't very standardized. It's largely unregulated, which means that while certainly in the US and in large cap companies around the world, CSR, ESG, sustainability reports are more and more common. So there is data, which there wasn't always the case. It's disclosed how and when companies want, and the frequency that they want, on the issues that they want. And often it's not made for investors. Half of the report is typically made for employees, for communities, for a regulator. And it doesn't say that on the tin, right? It doesn't say CSR report for regulators. But if you look at it, it's largely stories. It's not data. There's no comparisons. It's really, it can be a little light, or a mix of data and stories, which is understandable, but not extremely useful for investors. So what that means is that you still need humans to go in and dig up very non-standard data and put it into a standard rating system, or a slightly more standardized rating system. There are a couple ways that could change, right? So if it becomes regulated or required or pseudo-regulated that companies all disclose the same sets of issues in the same way, which sidebar is exactly what SASB is trying to do. So the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, which is meant to emulate FASB, but for sustainability information, then AI will be great at this, or even existing scraping systems will be great because the data will be standard and it will just be easy to absorb and process in the same way that traditional financial statements are right now. But as we alluded to, there's information that happens or that comes out, in the press or in ways that are non-standard that I think are especially relevant in this subfield for ESG issues, because ESG, like the acronym of ESG, is essentially a catch-all for, again, everything that doesn't fit on the financial statements, which could be a huge set of issues, right? Like
right.
10 years ago, cybersecurity, it wasn't clear if that was an ESG issue. It's pretty clear it is now. I think in 5 years, it's just going to be a financial issue. And there isn't necessarily a hard border between ESG and financial. That's certainly not what I think. But governance, corporate governance, wasn't a thing in the 80s, or at least not as important a thing as it is now. It's now obviously an ESG issue, but even folks who don't think ESG is interesting know that corporate governance is relevant for their investment process. So a lot of things will migrate from the edges into, I think ESG is sort of this outer border. And then as the topics become more relevant, as the problems and the solutions become more widespread, then they just migrate into traditional financial data. And I think AI will have a lot to do with accelerating that process. There are a couple of providers that have focused on trying to structure and make sense of unstructured data out there. Are they the only ones who are going to help solve this? No, as I mentioned, there are a couple of ways that could happen, but I'm sure the combination of all these forces will mean that we'll have a better, firmer sense of ESG data in a couple of years, however we get there.
Well, I've heard of some very large institutions that have access to all of the above for, I guess, kind of, on any given investment or any particular type of client, they're going to look at everything. Is that probably beyond the realm of most retail financial advisors being able to access? So they're going to have to really choose probably one and go with it.
Yeah, for sure. Or, beg, borrow, and steal, use a platform they already use that might also offer some sustainability data. Actually, Yahoo Finance has some sustainability metrics, so those are free. There are increasingly more of those. You mentioned Bloomberg, Thomson. Both of those offer their ESG data as part of the standard set, right? So if you have a Bloomberg terminal, you have access to a lot of ESG data that's labeled as such. Bloomberg has very helpfully built some ratios for you. It doesn't rate them or tell you which ones it think matters the most. That's not what Bloomberg does, but there is a lot already at your fingertips if you want to dive in. I think that if you want to dive in is a pretty significant caveat. Advisors are really stretched. There's a ton that they're being asked to do. Technology is another big ask and a big change in their industry. So I can understand advisor reluctance to really dive in and understand all this data. But I think there's a little bit required in order to use one of these tools well.
Right. Well, Claire, I think we're about at the end of our time. I really want to thank you for talking with us today and helping unpack this pretty complex, but I think very important aspect of investing that's actually only going to become more important as we move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, Davis.
Guys, this was great. I learned a ton, and the ESG has always been very interesting to me, so just sitting back and listening to you guys go back and forth was awesome. Thank you so much, Claire, for coming on the show. You were a wonderful guest.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
You bet. And Davis, thank you for bringing her. That's for sure.
Yeah, thanks.
And thank you all for listening. If you have not subscribed to the podcast yet, please click the subscribe now button below. This way, when Davis comes out with a new podcast, it'll show up directly on your listening device. This makes it much easier to share these podcasts with your colleagues. Thanks again for listening today. For everyone at WealthManagement.com, this is Eric Johnson reminding you to live your best day every day. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the WealthManagement.com podcast. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available.